Hello everyone. We have completed the introductory module for the course. You had a few assignments to complete for me in that. Just to give you a brief overview of what the course is about, what communication research is, before we jump into the material. In that module, you had a few small assignments for me, and I want to take the time in this video to talk a little bit about a couple of those. The first assignment that you completed for me was to simply go and do a very short survey for me that asked you about how confident you felt about your own abilities in relationship to some of the key skills and areas of research that we're going to be exploring more in this course. But this also survey served as a kind of example for research and some of the things that we'll be talking about more later on in the course. So in this short survey that you did for me, I asked you both kind of closed questions where I could collect quantitative data and some open-ended questions where I could collect qualitative data. And these serve two different purposes. Quantitative and qualitative data serve two different purposes when we engage in research ourselves. With quantitative data, when I ask Likert-style questions, so you answered a number of questions that asked you to rate things based on strongly agree to strongly disagree. Whenever you have a question that has a scale like that, these are called Likert-style questions. And these questions allow me to collect information where I can do some statistical analysis. I can figure what the average result is, what the mean, median, mode range is for a particular population. And with that, I can assess a kind of general trend. So I can get a sense overall of how confident is the class in general in their ability to use Google to find the information they need, for instance. That can be really useful in terms of, as I mentioned, give me just an overall picture, a kind of broad, sweeping picture of a group of people, of a larger population, of a general trend. That's different than the qualitative data. When I ask you to provide responses to open-ended questions, I can't, of course, then turn that into numerical information, which would give me a sense of general patterns or trends. But what I can do with that is to really use it to dig a little bit deeper, to get a sense not just of a sort of a broad overview, but of a little bit more in-depth, what might be some of the things that students are concerned about or excited about. Those are difficult things for me to assess through a kind of general trend, but they do help me to get a deeper understanding. I have to then, of course, do something with that data, we'll talk about in a minute, in order to make it useful. But that gives you kind of just a very brief understanding of the difference between quantitative and qualitative data. And this is a difference we'll come back to later on in the course. In general, a survey, too, is a particular type of method that I can use to gather information as a researcher. One really important thing to know about a survey is that surveys generally are self-reports. They ask people, if I do a survey, I ask people questions either about their own behavior or about what they think. And so it can be really useful if what I want to know is what someone thinks. So if I want to know how confident someone is about their own abilities, a survey is a really useful tool for that. But it's really important to recognize that that's not the same thing as assessing how good someone actually is in those abilities. It tells me what they think about their abilities, but it doesn't necessarily tell me what they can actually do. So surveys are almost always self-reports, so they can tell me what people think, but that's not quite the same thing as telling me what people do. That's also something we'll come back to and we'll talk about more in depth when we get into the section that discusses surveys specifically as a kind of methodological tool that you can use. So for instance, just to highlight the quantitative data, what I'm able to do from the Likert questions, where you had to indicate your feelings, is that I can take that information, I can turn it into numerical data. So I could assess overall, the class overall tends to feel pretty confident, above average, 3.69, in its ability to use the BSU library to find sources that they need. The average was 4, meaning, overall the class, the median, was 4, meaning all the class tends to feel fairly confident, but there may be a few more people who are a little less confident, so on and so forth, right? So I can get a general sense of the course that way. With the quantitative data, what I need to do is to be able to, come back to that. With the qualitative data, what I need to do is then, to make this useful to me as a researcher, is to go through it and decide, well, are there sort of key themes or ideas that pop out that give me some sense of what's the most significant or the most important within this data set. So for instance, if I read I'm most worried about, I might highlight that there's some major themes around time management, workload, the ability to find sources, so on and so forth. The most excited, research and writing techniques, topic and course material, so on and so forth. So we'll talk again more in depth later, but I want to give you just a preview that with quantitative data, oftentimes what I have to do, with qualitative data, what I have to do is go through and look for patterns or themes or major ideas in order to be able to make sense of that material at once. So for instance, content analysis, analyzing the content of messages, is one methodology where I might employ techniques like this to help me make sense of the research that I'm conducting. And just to highlight a few things, when I talk about surveys in general as mechanisms that allow me to assess what people think, it is really important to sort of be careful about this. So for instance, most students really felt very, very confident about their ability to use Google. That's the most confident in general. Makes sense, right? We use Google every day. You seem to be able to find information. But I just say be careful here, because one thing I notice when we get to the section where you will read some research about, or you will read some sources about how to use Google, is that students tend to be maybe overly confident here. There are a lot of tricks and techniques that you can employ in order to use Google much more effectively and efficiently than you probably know how to do right now. So that's one thing that I have found in this class, that how we feel about our ability to use those might not necessarily be the same as our ability to use those things effectively. I also just want to briefly touch on the browsing communication journals assignment that you conducted for me. Here was pretty basic. I asked you to look at 3 key journals and to pick out a few things that you were interested in and think about the kinds of articles and research that you were seeing. Really just as a way for you to start to look at what kinds of research gets published in the field of communication. So you can build a little bit of a sense of what that world looks like. I also chose these specific journals on purpose because they tend to fit very well with the different concentrations that we have in the communication department at BSU. A few of you noted that the journals themselves seem to offer articles that were sort of slightly different from one another. That's a really great observation, and it's very true. So just like scholarly disciplines, sociology might look a little bit different than communication, might look a little bit different than education, or so on and so forth. Even the specific journal that you look in will have its own sort of focus. So for instance, Communication, Culture, and Critique is going to be a journal that fits very well with broad media studies or communication and culture kind of concentration, whereas Public Relations Review obviously fits very well with the field of public relations. You also really noted a few important things. Many of you identified when asked to sort of think about what kinds of things get published, people noted that there's just really a broad array. I mean, one thing about communication as a discipline is that it takes from all the other disciplines. And so it really has connection with a really broad array of topics, everything from psychology to history to, law, for instance. And that within this broad array, however, there's oftentimes a focus on problems or even contemporary issues, things that you might be interested in just your everyday life from being a person who lives in this world. So issues about race, about gender, about contemporary events, Me Too, and things like this that we are seeing, or social media itself, the rise of social media and what that means in our lives. So many of you noted that, there is this sort of connection to everyday things that we might care about, even though they're sort of framed within this research language that might be different than the way we talk about them every day. So that research language itself is very detailed, complex, and in-depth. So a number of you had noted things like, the kind of structure of these articles or the specific vocabulary that gets used. That's really significant because that is exactly what research is supposed to do, is to take something that we are interested in, but give us a more complex picture of that. Now, for people who are new to the research world, that can create a little bit of difficulty because it might not be vocabulary that you are familiar with yet. You shouldn't worry too much about that. You are developing expertise in this field, but you aren't necessarily an expert yet. So as we work our way through this scholarly research throughout this class, you will find that some of these readings might be really pretty hard. Do not worry about that. Everything is hard when we first start. A few of you also noted that there were a lot of references. This is also true. I just really want to highlight here that one of the reasons that there is a lot of references is not just because people have read a lot and this provides evidence for the claims that an author is making, which it does, but also it represents that researchers aren't simply writing for themselves. Their references themselves explain part of this community of scholars that they are engaging with and that they are in conversation with. This notion of a community of scholars is something that we'll touch on more throughout this course. And then lastly, people really identified, much different than maybe the newspaper articles we might read on a regular basis, that scholarly research, these authors actually did their own research. They collected their own data, they conducted their own survey, or they constructed their own argument or theory. And that is a key point in academic research. It's something that really separates academic research from most of what we know in the world. Most of the time, our knowledge of the world just stems from sort of offhand observations or anecdotes, not a systematic analysis of information in the world. And that is the key difference in research in general, is that sort of systematic analysis. Because of that systematic analysis, one of the things to think about with research is the way it gives us a very in-depth, a very narrow but deep view of something that exists in the world. So we're going to talk a little bit more in your next module about different types of sources that you might use in the research process and how they give us different kinds of information that can be useful at different times, and depending on the project that we're interested in. But the thing to keep in mind with research, scholarly research that's usually published in scholarly journals, is that it gives us, instead of a broad kind of surface view, it tends to give us a very narrow but deep perspective on a topic.